Hello everyone, welcome back to another video on HAIKYU Fly High, and today I'll be doing a tier list for all of the characters in this game. Now the way I'm going to do my tier list will be by position, and the reason for this is quite simple because in this game when you try to build a team it's very strict about the number of players from each position, and you can't actually play a character out of position. So for example, if I choose Kageyama, I can't play him in any other position other than the setup. So that's kind of why it only makes sense for you to compare characters within the same positions. Now, I'm going to go through all of the positions. However, one position I'm not really going to talk too much about. It's going to be the setters. And the reason is, in this game, your team speciality is determined by which setter you play. And that can be then further broke down into 4 categories. And as a result, once again, it doesn't quite make sense for you to compare a setter between totally different speciality, because otherwise you just wouldn't be playing them. If you have an advantage over the opponent, you would just simply pick the setter which have that advantage, right? So it just doesn't make sense for you to compare the setter from different speciality either. And then if we actually take a look at a single speciality, you then realize there's only going to be like 2 or 3 characters in each one of them, and it just quite simply follows that SSR characters are better than the SR character. So there's not too much point of talking about the setters either. Now, before getting to the actual tier list itself, I just want to call out 2 things up front. One is that I am only going to rate SR units for higher, and the reason for this is because the game literally just gives you a couple SR units for every single position already through the tutorial, and there's just kind of like no excuse of you not able to find, at least 2 players of at least SR rarity for each of the position. So that's kind of why you will only see SR with higher rarity on my tier list, okay? And then the second thing is more of an apologies up from this game or this series just have way too many teams and too many characters for me to remember all of their names. So a lot of time you will see me just kind of point to the character or maybe drag them around to say that I'm talking about him, but I may not actually be able to remember his name off the top of my head. Okay, so just apologies up front for that. All right, now let's go to the actual tier list itself, and I'll be starting off with the wind spikers. So right now in this game, there are 2 wind spikers who clearly stand out from the rest, and that's going to be Tanaka and Iwazuyumi, both of which you can actually get from the newcomer banner, which is actually really, really nice. Out of the 2, I think Tanaka is slightly more towards early game, slightly better early game because he is a Karasuno player, and vast majority of people will be starting off with a team predominantly from Karasuno, so you just get a lot of like bonds both from the school bond and also character bond when you actually have Tanaka, which is quite nice. However, Iwazuyumi is going to shine slightly more towards the end game because he actually have a passive skill which gives a crit damage. Now, you probably wouldn't actually notice the impact of that crit damage early on because vast majority of the players would have pretty low base crit rate, and you kind of need to actually raise that crit rate chance using potentials. But early game, you wouldn't actually have all of the time to actually farm those substats. So that's kind of why you probably wouldn't actually notice the impact of Iwazuyumi straight away. However, as you move towards endgame, he's going to shine more and more. But overall, both of them are terrific characters, so you can't go wrong with either of them, okay? Then the next tier is going to be the A tier, and I put here at the top Futakushi, I think that's his name. Futakushi is actually a really good character because he can serve, he also have block skills, and obviously he can spike as well. I think he can spike anyway. And basically overall he's just very, very decent because he's a bit of an all-rounder. But what makes him not as good as the other 2 on the S tier is more the fact that to really get the most out of him, you actually need to pair him in a data tech team. And that's not just a problem for him, it's actually a problem for their entire school, because so many different characters from their school actually have skills which only can be activated when you have like multiple blockers up front. However, right now in this game, outside the mid blockers, I believe all of the only wind spiker and opposite hitter, etc., that actually have blocking skills are actually from his school, from data tech school. So as a result, if you actually want to get the best out of any of the players from their team, you kind of need to play the whole school. So that's kind of the reason why I'm going to rate him slightly lower. If you actually play like an actual data tech team, I think you can justify moving up to S tier. However, if we were just talking about that character by himself without considering team composition, then I'll probably say he's only going to be A tier, okay? Then the next character is going to be Asaki. Asaki has probably one of the most powerful spike in this game. However, he consumes 30 stamina every single time when you want to do that spike, which basically means you can probably spike twice and then your stamina is gone, and then you need to be subbed out. And that just makes a massive problem because right now, especially early on, we don't actually have that many SSR as your wing spiker. So if there's a one of your team members, such as Asahi, actually leave the field early, your backup option is likely going to be an SR unit who is not going to be nowhere near as good. So that's kind of why, from a team perspective, Asahi is not really going to cut it. He would actually get a bit more help if you actually max dupe him to solve that stamina problem. It still wouldn't solve it completely, but it would definitely help a lot. But I kind of want to say, if you actually need to be high dupe to be playable, then I'm going to penalize you for that. So that's kind of why I also have him only at 8 here. Okay. Then the next one is actually going to be an SR character, which is Yamamoto. Yamamoto is actually like the complete opposite of Asahi in the sense that he actually gives stamina to your team or to members of your team. So as a result, he is actually very, very useful and one of the few SR units which are actually playable at endgame because there are certain content when you need to, for example, play the best out of 3 or best out of 5 matches, or for example in the guild mode, there's actually a battle which I think lasts a solid 4 or 5 minutes, and for those kind of really really long matches, you are actually gonna benefit a lot by having Yamamoto because he can actually give stamina to other SSR members of your team and therefore make your team still perform throughout the whole match. So that's kind of why he's very very good. Now then we have two other characters who are in the next tier down, but I still think they are pretty nice because they're actually support characters rather than like a proper wing spiker, and that really shines when you're SR character because all of the SR characters in this game are not going to have as high raw stats as SSRs. However, if you actually have a passive skill which makes you more of like a supporter, what that basically means is even if your own raw stats is still very low, you are able to shine through your teammates, and that just kind of makes them slightly better than other members of the SR tier. So that's kind of why I put them on the next tier down. Like I said, I actually don't know their name off the top of my head, but I know this first guy, for example, he actually gives crit rate to your whole team, and then he also gives stamina, however, not as good as Yamamoto, and also I think that's only from his dupe ability, so that's kind of why I put him at a lower tier than Yamamoto, okay? But they're still very solid SR characters. Then we move on to the next tier, which are also going to be 3 decent SR characters. However, the problem with them is you actually need to play them in specific team to get the most out of them. So the obvious 2 is going to be the 2 from Daytech. They essentially have the same problem as Futakushi, like I mentioned earlier. So as a result, if you actually want to play them, you kind of need to play their entire school. So they are strong, but only when you play their entire school. And then for him, the problem is that he actually have a very, very strong ability, but which is basically whenever your team receive a normal, he can actually convert that to a perfect receive. Now, the problem is the trigger condition for that is that all 3 of your members at the back row need to have that receiver label, and not many characters in this game actually have that. So once again, in order for you to actually activate that, and also remember your team will be rotating around as you win points. So in order to actually for you to activate that skill consistently, you actually are tying yourself to a very very specific team where a lot of members on your team need to have that receiver label as you rotate around. So that's kind of why once again I think he's very very strong, but only when you play him in specific teams. And then on the bottom of the tiers, I have 3 characters who are still decent, but they are kind of like just they don't really have any team abilities. They can't really support the team much, so they're just very good by themselves. However, obviously, when you have a character which is only good by yourself and you only have the stats of an SR rarity rather than SSR, that essentially means you will eventually just get replaced in long term when you get a better SSR. So that's kind of why I just consider them as like budget replacement, and you probably only use them at early game when you don't actually have enough members to fill out your team, but eventually you will definitely retire them all, okay? Okay, now let's do the mid blockers next, and I'm going to start off by talking about Suki and also Kuro, because the two are actually somewhat similar. The reason why I put Suki as the only one on S tier, but Kuro on the 1 tier below that, is because if you actually just look at the raw block scaling, the scaling on Suki is actually slightly higher than Kuro, which is already making it nicer. And then what Kuro does on the offensive end is that he is able to increase his own attacking power, whereas what Suki is able to do is more supporting because he's actually able to give either crit rate or crit damage to your next attack. And that basically to me is slightly better because a lot of time you actually want to build your mid blockers more defensively. So increasing the firepower on mid block is not actually going to be as valuable let's say, actually have a supporting skill on your mid blocker, which you can then use to increase your more offensive members of the team. So that's kind of why if you actually compare the two, I just feel like Suki is slightly better on both defensive and also supporting end than Kuro, and that's kind of why I have him on S tier. However, Kuro is still going to be a very good character, and then you have the other SSR mid blockers who are not going to be as well rounded as Kuro, but normally excel more on either defensive end or on more on the defensive end. So starting off with Aeon, Aeon has much higher blocking ability than both Suki and Kuro. However, to get the most out of that, unfortunately, you kind of need to play a lot of members from his school. And then on the offensive end, he just have a very basic spike. So that's kind of why he is only going to be on the A tier. And then you have Hinata, who need to have no blocking ability, and therefore he is only going to be on the A tier. And then you have Lev, who have a blocking ability, but that's not his ultimate. So his ultimate is still more on the offensive end. So once again, that kind of just make me penalize him slightly more because I just prefer my mid blockers to be the one capable of blocking, especially right now in the game when pretty much like all of the blockers in this game are from the mid blocker position unless you're playing the date tech school. That's kind of why if I'm gonna play a mid blocker, I want him to be able to block, right, as the name suggests. So that's kind of why I just want to penalize any mid blocker who's more offensive oriented rather than defense. Okay, but then the last member on this A tier is actually going to be Yamaguchi. Now he is actually worthy purely because he is one of the best server in this game, and also a lot of mid blockers can't actually serve, so that basically makes him very valuable as a pinch server. And once again, he's one of the few SR characters who's actually playable at endgame. In fact, if I'm actually talking about endgame, he is probably actually going to be played more than Lev or Kuro or Aeon, because eventually they will actually be power crept by other characters, whereas Yamaguchi doesn't really get power crept that much because there isn't really another just like pure pinch server out there. So that's kind of why he is also deserving of this A tier. Okay, and then the next one is once again it's a support character. Like as I mentioned earlier, I just value support character a lot more when they are SR rarity, because you actually empower the rest of your team who may be SSR rarity, and therefore it's actually much better than you try to do something yourself when you have much lower raw stats. So that's kind of why I generally just prefer and rate support characters a bit higher when it comes to SR rarity. And the character I put here is going to be Inuka. And the reason why Inuka is actually going to be very good is because he is actually able to increase both your size block power and also receive power when your team is losing. And that's actually very important, because the trigger condition is actually pretty easy for you to fulfill. Or even if it's not fulfilled, then that means your team is winning. And if your team is already winning, you probably don't need that extra defense anyway. So that's kind of why I do actually really like his support skill, and I say he's worthy of this next tier. And then as for the remaining SR characters, I pretty much just sorted by whether they can block or whether they can't block, i.e. they don't have any blocking skills. And like I said earlier, the main rationale for this is that you are already not going to have many characters on your team who actually have blocking skills. Mid blocker is one of the few positions who you actually can do that. So make sure your mid blocker can actually block, right? So that's kind of why I put everyone with a blocking skill just going to be at one tier higher than those without any blocking skills. We'll move on to opposite hitters, and at the top of the list is obviously going to be the only UR character we have in the game right now, Ishijima. Just literally looking at his raw stats, he's already so much better than everyone else. So I don't think I need to talk too much here. He is just obviously going to be at the top of the tier. Then we have the SR characters, and I'm going to put Kentaro and also Daichi slightly in front of this guy from Daytech. And once again, the main reason is the guys from Daytech, they need to be played with other schoolmates. And if you are just talking about, one character by themselves, especially right now early game, vast majority of us is going to be predominantly Karasuno based. If we just talk about single player, then Kentaro and Daichi is going to be so much better. So that's kind of why they are going to be slightly higher in the S tier. And basically, if you actually want to differentiate between the two, Kentaro is the more offensive one. He has a strong spike. He can also have a surfing ability, which is actually quite useful as well. Whereas Daichi is more kind of the supporting character, also have a really good receive, etc. So his support skills giving stamina to your other team members. So they are kind of like both useful useful, just in different ways. Okay, and then like I said, this other guy, he's just more for if you actually play a date tech formation. He does have his niche, being the only officer hitter who can block right now. But once again, unless you are actually playing their school, otherwise you don't actually need that many people who can block. So that's kind of the problem with him. Okay, then we move on to the next tier. So on the B tier, I basically have the SR version of Kentaro and Daichi. The rationale is kind of similar. One's offensive, one's defensive. Daichi, this SR version of Daichi is actually really, really decent, to be honest. And then the SR version of Kentaro is the only SR character out of them who can actually have the serving skill. So once again, if you actually want to have like a pinch server for your opposite hitter, then Kentaro is kind of your man for the job, okay? And then at the end, it's just going to be other opposite hitters who are just not going to be as useful as Daichi or Kentaro. And lastly, we have the liberals, which as you can see, is going to be a super short list. Now, the S tier is just going to be the only SSR we have right now, which is Nishinoya. And then the A tier is going to be the SR version of him and also Yaku. Now, the SR version of Nishinoya is still very decent because he can give morale through his skill, so he does have that support ability. Whereas Yaku have this gimmick where when his receive is about to concede the point, you can actually change that into your opponent free ball instead, and that can potentially turn the match around. So that's kind of why both of them are actually very decent if you don't have the SSR version of Nishinoya. And then obviously the B tier is just going to be the last remaining SR